Picture this. You're sitting at your family's Thanksgiving table, wearing a thrift store sweater while your siblings flash their designer watches, and your father actually says the words, "Well, at least Marcus tried," when someone asks about your latest business failure. That was my reality for 32 years. I was the family disappointment, the one who couldn't hold down a corporate job, the brother who borrowed money for rent while my sister Victoria bought her third investment property. They called me the broke Thompson behind my back, and honestly, they weren't wrong. But here's the thing about being underestimated by the people who are supposed to love you most: it either breaks you completely, or it turns you into something unstoppable. And when my great-aunt Evelyn's lawyer called me on a rainy Tuesday morning to tell me I'd just inherited $20 million, well, let's just say the family dynamic was about to shift in ways none of us could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other disappointing day in my life. I was sitting in my cramped Milwaukee apartment, the one with the leaky faucet and the neighbor who practiced drums at 6 a.m., staring at another rejection email. This one was from a marketing firm downtown, the third company that week to pass on hiring me. The email was polite but firm, thanking me for my time while essentially telling me I wasn't qualified enough for their standards. I closed my laptop and rubbed my eyes, trying to ignore the stack of overdue bills sitting on my kitchen counter like a paper monument to my failures. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Family dinner this Sunday. Victoria has news to share. Try to dress nicely, Marcus." Even her texts carried that tone, that gentle disappointment that had become the soundtrack to my existence. Victoria always had news to share. Last month it was her promotion to senior partner at her law firm. The month before that, it was her engagement to some hedge fund manager named Bradford, who owned more cars than I'd owned in my entire lifetime. I was 32 years old, living paycheck to paycheck when I was lucky enough to have paychecks, and every family gathering felt like a performance review where I consistently failed to meet expectations. The Thompson family had always been about success, about appearances, about maintaining the reputation that my grandfather had built when he started Thompson and Associates back in the 1960s. What began as a small real estate agency had grown into one of Chicago's most respected development companies, handling multi-million-dollar projects and employing over 200 people. My father Robert had taken over in the 80s and expanded the business even further. Victoria had joined the family company straight out of law school and was already being groomed to take over operations. Derek, my younger brother, had surprised everyone by becoming a successful orthodontist, but he still consulted on the family business and owned several investment properties. And then there was me, Marcus Thompson, the family's cautionary tale about what happens when you don't apply yourself. I'd tried though. God knows I'd tried. After college, I'd worked for the family business for exactly 18 months before my father suggested I might be better suited for other opportunities. Translation: I wasn't cut out for the corporate world of development deals and client schmoozing, so I'd tried my hand at entrepreneurship, convinced that I just needed to find my niche. The food truck business had lasted 8 months before a combination of bad weather, worse location choices, and my complete inability to manage inventory had forced me to sell at a massive loss. The marketing agency I'd started with my college roommate had folded after a year when we realized neither of us actually knew how to run a business, despite our enthusiasm and a borrowed $15,000 from my parents that I was still slowly paying back. Each failure had been met with the same response from my family: disappointed sighs, gentle suggestions that maybe I should consider a more stable career path, and increasingly rare invitations to family business discussions. They loved me, I knew that, but they'd also written me off. I was the brother who needed help, not the one you turn to for advice. I was the son who might show up to dinner with holes in his jeans, not the one you bragged about to your country club friends. That particular Tuesday morning, as rain pelted my apartment windows and I contemplated whether I could afford both groceries and my electric bill that month, my phone rang. The number wasn't in my contacts, and the area code was from downstate Illinois. I almost didn't answer, figuring it was another debt collector or telemarketer, but something made me pick up. Is this Marcus Thompson? The voice was professional, crisp, belonging to someone who clearly had their life together in ways I could only dream about. Yeah, this is Marcus. Who's calling? Mr. Thompson, my name is David Sterling. I'm an attorney with Sterling Walsh and Associates. I'm calling regarding your great-aunt Evelyn Crawford. My heart skipped. Great-aunt Evelyn had passed away 6 months earlier at the age of 91. She'd been my grandfather's sister, a woman who'd never married and had spent her life traveling the world, investing in what she called interesting opportunities, and sending birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside to all her grandnieces and nephews. She'd been at every major family gathering, sitting in the corner with a glass of wine and the most fascinating stories about her adventures in Morocco or her thoughts on the tech industry. Most of the family had considered her a bit eccentric, especially when she'd started talking about her investments in something called cryptocurrency back in 2015. I hope there's nothing wrong with the estate proceedings, I said, genuinely confused about why a lawyer would be calling me specifically. Aunt Evelyn had been close to all of us, but I'd always assumed her assets would go to my father or be split among the family. Actually, Mr. Thompson, I'm calling because you're named as a beneficiary in Miss Crawford's will. We've been trying to reach you for several weeks, but the contact information we had was outdated. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd given Aunt Evelyn my current address. I'd moved 3 times in the past 2 years, each apartment smaller and cheaper than the last. A beneficiary? I mean, that's very kind, but I'm sure it's something small. Aunt Evelyn was always generous, but Mr. Thompson, David Sterling interrupted gently. I need you to sit down. The inheritance is substantial. Something in his tone made my legs weak. I sank into my ratty couch, the one I'd bought second-hand from a neighbor who was moving. How substantial? Miss Crawford has left you $23.7 million, along with her property portfolio, which includes commercial real estate in downtown Chicago, Minneapolis, and Seattle. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually looked around my apartment, as if the universe might be playing some elaborate practical joke. The apartment with the broken air conditioner and the carpet stains I'd never been able to get out. $23 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real, like someone had accidentally added too many zeros to a more reasonable amount. I'm sorry, did you say 23 million? Yes, sir. Miss Crawford was quite specific in her instructions. She left detailed notes explaining her reasoning for each bequest. According to her letter, she believed you had the most potential for growth and the least attachment to conventional thinking. She mentioned that she'd been watching your entrepreneurial efforts and felt you needed the resources to properly pursue your vision. I started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the kind of hysterical giggling that happens when your brain can't.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Process what it's hearing. Aunt Evelyn had been watching my failures, my spectacular, embarrassing business failures that had made me the family disappointment. And somehow, she'd seen potential. David Sterling continued talking, explaining trust structures and tax implications and the need for me to come to Chicago to sign paperwork, but I barely heard him. All I could think about was Sunday dinner. All I could think about was my father's subtle head shakes when I'd mentioned my latest job interviews. All I could think about was Victoria's pitying smiles and Derek's well-meaning but condescending advice about maybe considering a career in education or social work, something more suitable to my temperament. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for 3 hours, staring at the wall. $23 million. Plus real estate. Plus whatever other assets Aunt Evelyn had accumulated during her 91 years of what everyone had assumed was charming but financially irresponsible world travel. The woman they'd all thought was a little too eccentric, a little too unconventional, had apparently been building a fortune that dwarfed anything the Thompson family business had ever generated. I thought about every family dinner where I'd sat quietly while they discussed business deals and investment strategies. Every conversation where I'd been subtly excluded from serious financial discussions because I was the one who wasn't good with money. Every time someone had changed the subject when I'd tried to share an idea for a new business venture, their expressions polite but dismissive. The irony was overwhelming. They'd spent years treating me like the family charity case, the one who needed help and guidance and gentle steering toward more realistic goals. And now, through no effort of my own, I was about to become wealthier than all of them combined. Wealthier than the family business that had been built over 3 generations. Wealthier than Victoria with her law firm partnership and her investment properties. Wealthier than Derek with his thriving orthodontics practice and his stock portfolio. But as the shock began to wear off, something else settled in. This wasn't just about money. This was about everything I'd wanted to prove but never had the resources to attempt. All those business ideas that had failed because I'd been undercapitalized and inexperienced, operating on borrowed money and sheer determination. All those nights I'd lain awake thinking about what I could accomplish if I just had the backing to do it right, to take the time to plan properly, to hire the right people and build something substantial. I thought about Aunt Evelyn's note, about her belief that I had potential for growth and the least attachment to conventional thinking. The rest of my family had seen those traits as flaws, as evidence that I wasn't serious or focused enough for real success. But Aunt Evelyn had seen them as strengths. She'd seen something in my failures that everyone else had missed. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and legal meetings. David Sterling walked me through the inheritance process, explaining the various assets and accounts that Aunt Evelyn had accumulated. It turned out that her eccentric investment strategies had been brilliantly unconventional. She'd bought Bitcoin when it was trading for hundreds of dollars, not thousands. She'd invested in small tech startups that had become major companies. She'd purchased commercial real estate in cities that were just beginning their urban renewal, holding properties that were now worth 50 times what she'd paid for them. But the most surprising discovery was the letter she'd left specifically for me. David Sterling handed it to me on Thursday afternoon in his downtown Chicago office that overlooked the same streets where my family's business operated. Marcus, the letter began in Aunt Evelyn's careful handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I've finally managed to escape this mortal coil and you're probably sitting in some lawyer's office feeling completely overwhelmed. Good. Being overwhelmed means you understand the magnitude of what's happening, and understanding magnitude is the first step toward handling responsibility properly. I've been watching you for years, dear boy, and I've seen something that the rest of your family has missed. They look at your failures and see evidence that you're not cut out for their world. I look at your failures and see evidence that their world isn't big enough for what you're trying to build. Every time you've started a business, you've thought differently than they do. Every time you've taken a risk, you've been willing to try something they considered too unconventional. That's not a flaw, Marcus. That's exactly what this family needs. Your father and Victoria and Derek are excellent at managing existing systems. They're brilliant at taking something that works and making it work better, more efficiently, more profitably. But they're not innovators. They're not visionaries. They see a market and they enter it competently. You see a market and you imagine how to transform it entirely. I'm giving you this inheritance because I believe you're the only one in this family with the courage to build something genuinely new, something that matters beyond quarterly earnings and annual growth percentages. Use this money to prove what I already know, that being different isn't the same as being wrong. I read the letter 3 times sitting in David Sterling's office while Chicago traffic hummed 20 floors below. Aunt Evelyn had seen me more clearly than I'd ever seen myself. She'd understood something that I'd been struggling to articulate for years, that my failures hadn't been about lack of ability or commitment, they'd been about trying to build revolutionary ideas with conventional resources. But now I had unconventional resources. Now I had $23 million and a real estate portfolio and the complete freedom to build something exactly the way I envisioned it, without having to compromise or cut corners or settle for good enough because it was all I could afford.
Thanks.
And I knew exactly what I was going to build. The first thing I decided was that I wouldn't tell my family about the inheritance. Not yet. Sunday dinner was 3 days away, and I wanted to experience one more family gathering as the disappointing Marcus before everything changed forever. I wanted to see their expressions, hear their subtle condescension, feel that familiar weight of being the family failure one last time. Because I knew that once they learned about Aunt Evelyn's gift, their entire attitude would shift and I'd never again get to witness the pure, unfiltered way they really saw me. So I showed up to dinner at my parents' sprawling suburban Chicago home wearing the same outfit I always wore: khakis from Target, a button-down shirt that had seen better days, and shoes I'd bought 3 years ago that were starting to separate at the seams. The house hadn't changed since my childhood, all dark wood and heavy furniture that screamed old money and established success. Family portraits lined the hallways, showing 3 generations of Thompsons who'd built something significant with their lives. And there at the end of the hall was the portrait they'd had taken 2 years ago. My parents, Victoria in her expensive suit, Derek with his perfect orthodontist smile, and me looking uncomfortable and slightly out of focus, like the camera couldn't quite figure out where I belonged in the family composition. Victoria was already holding court in the living room when I arrived, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly. She'd driven up from downtown in her new Tesla, the one she'd bought to celebrate her latest promotion. Derek was there with his wife Amanda, both of them glowing with the success of people who'd figured out exactly how to navigate the world to their advantage. They were discussing vacation plans, something about a month in Tuscany that Derek was planning for the summer. Marcus, my mother's voice carried that particular tone of forced enthusiasm she used when she was trying to compensate for her disappointment in me. We were just talking about Derek's plans for Italy. Isn't that wonderful? I nodded and smiled, playing my part perfectly. Sounds amazing. I've always wanted to travel more. The truth was, I could barely afford a weekend trip to Wisconsin, but admitting that would only invite more of their concerned looks and gentle suggestions about career counseling. My father appeared from his study, where he'd probably been on a conference call about some multi-million-dollar development project. Robert Thompson commanded attention just by walking into a room. At 68, he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire and saw no reason to apologize for his success. He shook my hand with the slightly firm grip that was meant to convey both affection and subtle disappointment that I hadn't inherited his drive for conventional achievement. Marcus, good to see you. How's the job search going? There it was, the question that had defined every family interaction for the past 2 years. Not how are you doing or what's new in your life, but specifically about my employment status, because that was the only metric by which they measured my worth as a human being. Still exploring options, I replied, which was technically true. I was exploring the option of never needing to work for anyone else again, but they didn't need to know that yet. Victoria looked up from her conversation about Italian wine tours. Marcus, you know Bradford's firm is always looking for administrative assistants. It's not glamorous, but it's steady work and they offer good benefits. Administrative assistant. My sister, who'd been born 18 months after me and had somehow managed to lap me 3 times in terms of life achievement, was suggesting I consider fetching coffee and filing paperwork for her fiancé's hedge fund. The suggestion wasn't meant to be cruel. I knew that. In Victoria's mind, she was being helpful, offering a practical solution to my chronic unemployment problem. But the casual way she'd reduced my career prospects to entry-level office work, as if that was the ceiling of my potential, felt like a slap. That's thoughtful of you to think of me, I said, maintaining the mild, grateful tone that had become my default setting at family gatherings. I'll definitely consider that. Derek jumped in with his own helpful suggestion. You know, Marcus, have you thought about going back to school, maybe getting your teaching certificate? You've always been good with people, and teachers have job security. Teaching? Another safe, respectable profession that my family could explain to their friends without embarrassment. Oh, Marcus, he's a teacher. Very noble work. It wasn't that I had anything against teaching, but the suggestion felt like another attempt to steer me toward a career that would require minimal ambition and offer minimal risk of spectacular failure. We moved to the dining room, where my mother had prepared her usual elaborate Sunday spread. The table was set with the good china, the kind that required careful handling and represented 3 months of my rent. As we passed around dishes of perfectly prepared food, the conversation naturally turned to business and investments, the language my family spoke most fluently. Victoria was explaining some complex legal matter involving zoning regulations and tax incentives. Derek was discussing his latest real estate acquisition, a duplex in a gentrifying neighborhood that he'd bought as an investment property. My father was nodding approvingly, occasionally offering insights from his decades of experience in development and property management. They spoke with the casual confidence of people who understood money, who knew how to make it work for them, who'd never experienced the particular anxiety of choosing between paying rent and buying groceries. I sat quietly, cutting my perfectly prepared roast beef and listening to them discuss financial strategies that involved more money than I'd ever seen in one place. This was the world I'd been born into but had never managed to successfully navigate. These were the people who loved me but had long ago accepted that I simply wasn't built for their level of success. Speaking of investments, my mother said, turning to me with that encouraging smile she used when she was about to suggest something she thought would be good for me. Mrs. Henderson from the country club was telling me about her son-in-law's insurance business. They're looking for sales associates, and she said they provide excellent training. Very stable industry. Insurance sales. I nearly choked on my wine, which was probably worth more than my monthly grocery budget. They'd progressed from administrative assistant to teaching to insurance sales. Each suggestion a little more desperate, a little more willing to accept that my ceiling was considerably lower than anyone had initially hoped. That's definitely something to explore, I managed to say, because what else could I say? That I was currently worth more than all of them combined. That Aunt Evelyn's eccentric investment strategies had made her wealthier than 3 generations of Thompson business success. That the family disappointment was about to become the family's most successful member by a margin so wide it would require scientific notation to express properly. Victoria was telling a story about closing some massive corporate deal when my father's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned, the expression of a man who'd spent 40 years making sure business calls didn't interrupt family time unless they were genuinely urgent. "I'm sorry, I need to take this. It's about the Riverside project." He stepped away from the table, and I could hear him speaking in the confident, authoritative tone he used with clients and contractors. Derek turned to me while Dad was out of the room. "Marcus, I've been thinking about your situation, and I have an idea that might interest you. Amanda and I are looking for someone to help manage our rental properties. It's not full-time, but it's steady income, and it would give you experience in real estate management. Maybe it could lead to something bigger down the road. Property management for my little brother's rental empire." The family disappointment reduced to collecting rent checks and handling maintenance complaints for Derek's investment portfolio. I looked at his earnest face, saw the genuine desire to help, and realized that this was probably the best offer I was going to get from my family. In their minds, they were throwing me a lifeline, offering me a chance to climb out of my cycle of failure and grab onto the bottom rung of respectability. "That's really generous of you to think of me," I said, and I meant it. Derek wasn't trying to insult me. He was trying to solve the Marcus problem in the most practical way possible. "Let me think about it and get back to you." My father returned to the table, sliding his phone into his pocket with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just solved someone else's expensive problem with a few well-chosen words. "Sorry about that. The Riverside contractors were having issues with the permit timeline, but we got it sorted out." "How much is that project worth?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious about the family business that she was increasingly involved in managing. $42 million when it's complete. Residential and commercial mixed use, 300 units plus retail space, should be finished by next spring if we keep the contractors on schedule. $42 million. My father said it casually, the way other people might mention spending $42. This was the scale they operated on. The level of success that defined their world. And here I sat, unemployed and wearing discount store clothes, listening to them discuss projects that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. But here's what they didn't know. Aunt Evelyn's real estate portfolio alone was worth $38 million. Her liquid assets pushed the total inheritance to over $60 million when David Sterling had finished explaining all the various accounts and investments. I was sitting at their table, letting them offer me entry-level jobs and rental property management positions, when I could have written a check to buy their entire business twice over. The conversation moved on to Derek's vacation plans, Victoria's wedding preparations, and my mother's latest charitable committee work. I participated when asked direct questions, maintained my role as the grateful but underachieving family member, and waited for the evening to end. Because tomorrow everything was going to change. After dinner, as we stood in the foyer saying our goodbyes, my mother pulled me aside with the expression she used when she wanted to have a serious conversation without making it feel like an intervention. "Marcus, honey, I want you to know that your father and I are proud of you for keeping trying. I know things have been difficult lately, but everyone finds their path eventually. Some people just take longer to figure out where they belong. Where they belong." As if the problem was that I hadn't yet discovered my proper place in the hierarchy of family success, rather than the possibility that the hierarchy itself might be flawed. As if my failures to thrive in their conventional business world meant I needed to find a different, smaller corner of that same world, rather than the possibility that I might be designed for something entirely different. "Thanks, Mom, I really appreciate the support." And I did appreciate it, even as it stung. They loved me enough to keep trying to fix me, even though they'd long ago given up hope that I might fix myself. Victoria hugged me goodbye, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume, the kind that cost more than my monthly utilities. "Think about what I said about Bradford's firm, okay? It's a good opportunity, and you need something stable." Derek shook my hand with his firm, orthodontist grip. "And don't forget about the property management idea. I'm serious about that offer." My father walked me to the door, putting his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be encouraging but felt weighted with disappointment. "Marcus, I know you're going to figure this out. You're a Thompson and Thompsons don't give up. Sometimes it just takes time to find the right fit." The right fit. As if success was simply a matter of finding the correctly sized hole for my particular peg, rather than the possibility that I might need to build an entirely new board. As if my repeated failures in their world were evidence that I needed to try harder to conform, rather than evidence that their world might not be big enough for what I was trying to create. I drove home to my crappy apartment in my 7-year-old Honda Civic, past Victoria's Tesla and Derek's luxury SUV, past the neighborhood where they all lived in houses that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I sat in my parking spot outside my building, looking up at the windows of my one-bedroom apartment with the leaky faucet and the neighbor who practiced drums, and I started laughing again. 24 hours ago this had been my reality. The disappointing son, the underachieving brother, the family member who needed career advice and financial help and gentle steering toward more realistic goals. 24 hours ago, I'd been driving home from family dinner feeling like exactly what they thought I was. A 32-year-old failure who couldn't get his life together. But now I knew something they didn't know. Knew that Aunt Evelyn had been watching all of us, evaluating all of us, and had decided that the family disappointment was actually the family's best bet for genuine innovation and meaningful change. I knew that my failures hadn't been evidence of incompetence, but evidence that I'd been trying to build something bigger than my resources could support. And now I had resources that could support anything I could dream of building. I pulled out my phone and called David Sterling. Even though it was almost 9 p.m. on a Sunday, he answered on the second ring, which told me something about the kind of service you get when you're inheriting $60 million. "Marcus, good to hear from you. I hope you've had time to process everything we discussed." "I have," I said, looking up at my apartment building and thinking about the conversation I'd just had with my family. "And I'm ready to move forward. I want to set up meetings with investment advisors, real estate specialists, and business development consultants. I have some ideas about what I want to build with this inheritance, and I'm going to need the right team to make it happen. Excellent. I can have a full team assembled by Wednesday. Shall we meet at my office downtown? Actually, I said, thinking about my father's casual mention of his $42 million development project, I want to start by looking at commercial real estate in Chicago. I'm thinking about launching a new kind of development company, something focused on sustainable housing and innovative urban planning. I want to build something that transforms how people think about residential development. David Sterling was quiet for a moment, probably processing the fact that his new client was talking about launching a development company that would compete directly with his own family's business. That's certainly ambitious. And with your inheritance, it's definitely feasible. We should talk about market analysis and competitive positioning. We should, I agreed. But first, I want to understand exactly what assets I have to work with. I want to know every property, every account, every investment that Aunt Evelyn left me. Because I'm not just inheriting money, David. I'm inheriting the foundation for something much bigger than anyone in my family has ever built. After I hung up, I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, thinking about the conversation I'd just had with Derek about managing his rental properties. Property management. My little brother had offered me a part-time job managing his small-scale real estate investments, not knowing that I was about to become the largest property owner in the family. But the real irony wasn't the money. The real irony was that they'd been right about one thing: I did need to find where I belonged. I just hadn't belonged in their world of incremental success and conventional thinking. I'd belonged in Aunt Evelyn's world of bold investments and transformative vision, and it had taken her death for me to discover that world even existed. Tomorrow, I would start building something that would make my father's $42 million project look like a practice exercise. Tomorrow, I would begin proving that the family disappointment had actually been the family visionary all along. But tonight, I climbed the stairs to my cramped apartment one last time, knowing that this would be the last night I spent as the broke Thompson, the last night I went to bed worried about rent money and utility bills, the last night I felt like the family failure. Because tomorrow, everything was going to change. And my family had no idea what was coming. The first thing I did on Monday morning was quit my job search. Not that I had any interviews lined up, but I deleted my profiles from every job board, closed my LinkedIn Premium subscription, and threw away the stack of business cards from networking events that had been sitting on my desk like a monument to false hope. There's something liberating about abandoning the pretense that you need what everyone else thinks you need, especially when you've just discovered you have the resources to build exactly what you want instead. David Sterling had arranged for me to meet his team at 10 a.m. in a conference room that overlooked the Chicago River. The building itself was everything my family's business aspired to be: sleek, modern, filled with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from handling serious money for serious people. I walked through the lobby wearing my best suit, which was still obviously off the rack and 3 years old, but I carried myself differently than I had just days before. Money might not buy happiness, but it definitely buys confidence, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged in rooms where important decisions were made. The team David had assembled was impressive in that understated way that truly wealthy people prefer. Margaret Chen was a real estate investment specialist who managed portfolios for clients with assets in the hundreds of millions. Thomas Rodriguez was a business development consultant who'd helped launch 3 companies that had gone public in the past decade. Janet Miller was a tax attorney who specialized in complex inheritance structures and wealth preservation strategies. These were not the kind of people who would have returned my phone calls a week ago, but Aunt Evelyn's inheritance had apparently earned me a seat at tables I'd never even known existed. "Before we discuss your future plans," Margaret said, spreading a series of documents across the polished conference table, "let's review exactly what you've inherited. Your aunt was remarkably strategic in her investments, particularly her real estate acquisitions. She opened a leather portfolio that contained detailed reports on each property in Aunt Evelyn's collection. The numbers were staggering, but more impressive than the dollar amounts was the intelligence behind each purchase. Aunt Evelyn hadn't just bought expensive properties, she'd bought properties that were positioned to benefit from long-term urban development trends that she'd apparently seen coming years before anyone else. The commercial building in downtown Minneapolis had been purchased in 2018, just before the city's tech boom transformed that particular district into one of the most sought-after business locations in the Midwest. The mixed-use development in Seattle had been acquired in 2019, right before remote work trends made residential properties with integrated office space incredibly valuable. The Chicago properties included 3 buildings in neighborhoods that were just beginning to gentrify, areas where property values had tripled since Aunt Evelyn's purchases. She was particularly interested in sustainable development, Thomas Rodriguez added, pulling up photos of several properties on his tablet. Look at this building in Portland. She bought it in 2020 and immediately invested $2 million in retrofitting it with solar panels, energy-efficient heating systems, and sustainable materials. The building is now carbon neutral and commands premium rents because of its environmental features. This was the detail that caught my attention. Aunt Evelyn hadn't just been accumulating wealth, she'd been building a portfolio that reflected a vision of what the future of urban development should look like. She'd been investing in the same kinds of sustainable, innovative housing solutions that I'd been dreaming about but had never had the resources to pursue. She left detailed notes about her investment philosophy, Janet Miller said, handing me a folder that was thicker than most novels. She believed that traditional real estate development was fundamentally flawed because it prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. She thought the industry needed someone who could think beyond quarterly earnings and focus on creating housing that would still be desirable and environmentally responsible 50 years from now. I opened the folder and found page after page of Aunt Evelyn's handwritten observations about urban planning, environmental sustainability, and what she called human-centered development. She'd been studying the same issues that had fascinated me during my failed attempts at entrepreneurship, but she'd had the resources and patience to research them properly, to understand the market forces and regulatory challenges that I'd never been able to navigate. One note in particular jumped out at me: the problem with family businesses is that they become too comfortable with incremental success. They stop asking big questions because they're afraid of big failures. But the biggest failure is never asking the questions at all. She'd been watching my family's business, I realized. She'd been watching my father's steady conservative approach to development, Victoria's legal strategies that prioritized risk management over innovation, Derek's safe investments in established neighborhoods with proven returns. And she'd seen what I'd been trying to articulate for years, that their approach, while successful, was fundamentally limited by their unwillingness to imagine truly transformative possibilities. Based on these notes and your inheritance portfolio, Margaret said, I think we can assume your aunt intended for you to enter the development business. The question is whether you want to compete directly with your family's company or focus on a different market segment. Compete directly with Thompson and Associates. The phrase sent a thrill through me that was equal parts excitement and terror. 3 days ago, I'd been considering Derek's offer to manage his rental properties part-time. Now I was sitting in a conference room discussing whether to launch a development company that would rival the business my grandfather had spent 60 years building. What would it take, I asked, to launch a sustainable development company that could handle projects in the $20 to $50 million range? Thomas Rodriguez consulted his tablet, running through what looked like complex financial projections. With your current assets, you could easily capitalize a company at that level. The bigger questions are market positioning, regulatory expertise, and team building. Development at that scale requires specialists in everything from environmental law to sustainable construction materials. But it's definitely feasible, Margaret added. Especially given your existing property portfolio. Several of your inherited buildings could serve as showcase properties, demonstrations of what sustainable development can achieve when it's done properly. I spent the next 3 hours learning about LLC structures and investment strategies and the dozens of legal and financial considerations that go into launching a major development company. It was the kind of business education that I'd never been able to afford, the kind of comprehensive planning that had been missing from all my previous entrepreneurial attempts. For the first time in my life, I had access to the resources and expertise that could turn ambitious ideas into actual business plans. But the most important conversation happened after the formal meeting ended. Janet Miller lingered as the others packed up their materials, and I could tell she had something specific she wanted to discuss privately. Marcus, she said, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you told your family about the inheritance? I shook my head. Not yet, I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I said anything. She nodded approvingly. That was wise. I've handled several inheritance cases where family dynamics became complicated once significant money was involved. People's attitudes can change dramatically when they discover someone they've written off financially has suddenly become wealthier than they are. You think I should keep it secret? I think you should be strategic about how and when you reveal it. Once your family knows about the inheritance, every interaction you have with them will be colored by that knowledge. They'll second-guess their previous treatment of you, they'll wonder whether you're keeping score of old slights, and they'll probably assume that anything you accomplish going forward is simply the result of having money rather than having talent or vision. This hadn't occurred to me, but as soon as Janet said it, I knew she was right. My family had spent years treating me like the member who needed help and guidance. Once they learned that I was now the wealthiest Thompson by a significant margin, they'd have to reconcile that knowledge with their established narrative about my capabilities and potential. Either they'd decide that Aunt Evelyn had made a mistake, or they'd have to acknowledge that their assessment of me had been fundamentally wrong. What do you suggest? Build something first. Launch your development company, complete your first project, establish yourself as a legitimate competitor in the market. Let your success speak for itself before you reveal the source of your capital. That way, when they learn about the inheritance, they'll have to confront the fact that you've already proven yourself capable of using it effectively. I walked out of that meeting with a clear plan and a timeline that was both ambitious and terrifying. Within 6 months, I wanted to have launched Thompson Sustainable Development and begun work on my first major project. Within a year, I wanted to have completed a showcase development that would establish my company as a serious player in the sustainable housing market. And within 2 years, I wanted to have grown large enough that my family would have no choice but to acknowledge that the disappointment they'd written off had built something more innovative and successful than anything Thompson and Associates had ever achieved. But first, I needed to find the right property for my inaugural project. Margaret had given me a list of potential acquisition targets, buildings and lots that were positioned for sustainable development but hadn't yet attracted the attention of major developers. I spent the rest of the week driving around Chicago, looking at properties with the kind of serious intent I'd never been able to afford before. The property that caught my attention was a defunct manufacturing complex on the north side of the city. 23 acres of abandoned industrial buildings in a neighborhood that was just beginning to attract young professionals and small businesses. The previous owner had tried to develop it twice, but both attempts had stalled due to environmental remediation costs and zoning complications. It was exactly the kind of challenging, complex project that established developers avoided because the risks and regulatory hurdles weren't worth the potential returns. But I wasn't an established developer trying to maximize quarterly profits. I was someone with enough capital to absorb the upfront costs of environmental cleanup and enough patience to work through the zoning process properly. More importantly, I was someone who saw the property not as a problem to be solved efficiently, but as an opportunity to demonstrate what sustainable urban development could accomplish when it was done without cutting corners. I called Margaret Chen and told her I wanted to make an offer on the manufacturing complex. She was quiet for a long moment before responding. Marcus, that's a very challenging first project. The environmental issues alone could take months to resolve, and you'd be dealing with at least 3 different city departments for permits and approvals. Are you sure you want to start with something that complex? I'm sure, I said, standing in the middle of the abandoned complex and envisioning what it could become. This is exactly the kind of project that nobody else wants to tackle properly. That's what makes it perfect for establishing what we can do differently. She sighed, but I could hear the respect in her voice. All right, let's make an offer. But we're going to need a very strong legal and environmental consulting team if you're serious about turning this into a sustainable development showcase. Within 48 hours, I was the owner of a 23-acre industrial complex that most developers considered a liability. I'd paid $6 million for property that would probably require another $8 million in environmental cleanup and infrastructure improvements before construction could even begin. By conventional real estate metrics, it was a terrible investment that would tie up capital for years before generating any returns. But I wasn't thinking in conventional terms anymore. I was thinking about what Aunt Evelyn had written in her notes about asking bigger questions and refusing to accept incremental solutions. I was thinking about building something that would still matter 50 years from now, something that would demonstrate that sustainable development wasn't just environmentally responsible but economically superior when you were willing to take the long view. Most importantly, I was thinking about my family's reaction when they discovered that the son and brother they'd written off as a failure had quietly launched a development company that was tackling projects too complex for established firms to handle profitably. But that revelation was still months away. For now, I was simply Marcus Thompson, unemployed and living in a crappy apartment, who just made the largest real estate purchase of his life using money that nobody knew he had. I was the family disappointment who was about to transform an abandoned industrial complex into a model of sustainable urban development, and I was going to do it so quietly and efficiently that by the time anyone noticed what I was building, it would already be too late for them to dismiss it as another one of my impractical dreams. The construction contracts were signed by the end of the week. Environmental remediation would begin in 30 days. The architectural plans were already in development, designed around principles of energy efficiency and sustainable materials that were still considered experimental by most developers. I'd assembled a team of contractors and consultants who specialized in exactly the kind of innovative construction that my family's business had always considered too risky to pursue. And through it all, I continued living in my small apartment, driving my aging Honda, and maintaining the pretense of unemployment every time my mother called to check on my job search. Because Janet Miller had been right, the revelation about the inheritance would be much more powerful after I'd already proven what I could accomplish with it. My family thought they knew who I was and what I was capable of. They were about to discover that they'd been wrong about both, and the discovery was going to change everything about how they saw themselves and their own achievements. But first, I had a sustainable development complex to build, and unlike every other project I'd ever attempted, this one was going to succeed spectacularly. The environmental cleanup took 4 months, not the 3 I'd originally projected, but the delay turned out to be a blessing in disguise. While the remediation crews worked to remove decades of industrial contamination from the soil, I used the extra time to refine the architectural plans and secure the kind of construction team that most developers could never afford to hire. When you have unlimited capital and no investors demanding quick returns, you can afford to do things the right way instead of the fast way. My family, meanwhile, had no idea what I was building 6 miles from their suburban comfort zone. My mother still called every Tuesday to check on my job search, offering increasingly desperate suggestions about career counseling and temporary employment agencies. Victoria had started sending me job listings via email, mostly administrative positions at companies where she had connections. Derek had called twice to follow up on his property management offer, clearly concerned that I was taking too long to accept what he considered a generous opportunity. I played my part perfectly, maintaining the fiction that I was struggling with unemployment and grateful for their concern. When my mother invited me to Derek's birthday dinner in October, I showed up wearing the same discount store outfit I'd worn to every family gathering for the past 2 years. I listened to Victoria describe her latest legal triumph and Derek discuss his plans for a second rental property purchase. I nodded appreciatively when my father mentioned that Thompson and Associates had just landed their biggest contract ever, a $65 million mixed-use development that would cement their reputation as one of Chicago's premier development firms. $65 million. My father announced it with the pride of a man who just achieved the pinnacle of his professional career. It was the largest single project in the company's history, the culmination of 3 generations of careful business building and relationship cultivation. The entire family celebrated as if they just won the lottery, and in their world, they essentially had. What they didn't know was that my environmental cleanup alone had cost more than most developers spent on entire projects. What they couldn't have imagined was that while they were celebrating their $65 million contract, I was finalizing construction plans for a sustainable development complex that would cost $82 million to build and would establish an entirely new standard for environmentally responsible urban housing. The construction phase began in November, and that's when maintaining my secret became genuinely challenging. The project site was visible from the highway that Derek took to his orthodontics practice, and twice he mentioned seeing major construction activity in that area. Victoria drove past it regularly on her way to court appearances downtown and had commented to my mother about the scope of whatever was being built there. My father, who knew every major development project in the city through his industry connections, had started asking colleagues about the mysterious construction site that seemed to have unlimited funding and no public information about the development company behind it. I'd incorporated Thompson Sustainable Development as a private company with intentionally vague public filings. The construction permits listed me as the project manager, but my name meant nothing to city officials who processed hundreds of development applications every month. To anyone who bothered to investigate, it looked like an out-of-state development firm with deep pockets and a preference for privacy. Nothing about the public records suggested any connection to the Thompson family or their established real estate business. But secrets have a way of creating their own pressure, and by December, I was starting to feel the weight of maintaining my double life. During the day, I met with contractors and architects and environmental consultants, making decisions that affected millions of dollars and hundreds of future residents. During the evening, I ate dinner with my family and listened to them offer career advice to someone they assumed was unemployed and directionless. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner, when my father made an observation that froze my blood. "You know," he said, carving the turkey with the ceremonial precision he brought to every family tradition, "I've been hearing interesting things about that construction project on the north side. Whoever's behind it is sparing no expense on environmental features. Solar arrays, geothermal heating, sustainable building materials that cost 3 times what most developers would spend." Victoria looked up from her wine with genuine curiosity. "What kind of budget are they working with?" "Hard to say exactly, but the permits suggest it's in the 80 to 90 million range. That's serious money, and the environmental specifications are unlike anything I've seen from Chicago developers. It's the kind of project that someone builds when they care more about making a statement than making a quick profit." Derek was cutting his turkey into perfectly equal pieces, a habit left over from his precision-focused dental training. "Any idea which company is behind it?" My father shook his head. "That's the strange part. The development company appears to be new, privately funded, with no track record in Chicago real estate. Usually, projects of that scale involve firms with established relationships and proven experience. This seems to be someone with substantial capital, but no local history." I kept eating my mashed potatoes, grateful that my family couldn't see my hands trembling slightly under the table. They were discussing my project, analyzing my business strategy, speculating about my resources and motivations, without having any idea that the mysterious developer they were trying to identify was sitting 3 feet away from them. My mother jumped in with her own theory. Maybe it's one of those tech billionaires who made their fortune in California and decided to invest in Chicago real estate. I read an article about Silicon Valley money flowing into Midwest cities. That would make sense, Victoria agreed. Someone with enough capital that they can afford to prioritize environmental features over immediate returns. It takes serious money to build sustainably from the ground up. Serious money. If only they knew how serious. If only they could see the irony of sitting around their Christmas table, offering career counseling to their unemployed family member, while simultaneously discussing the project that same family member was financing with resources that dwarfed their own business success. But the conversation that really shook me happened after dinner, when Victoria cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping clear dishes. "Marcus," she said in the tone she used when she was about to offer unwanted but well-intentioned advice, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I want to make you an offer." I braced myself for another suggestion about administrative work or insurance sales. Bradford's firm is expanding, and they're looking for someone to handle client relations for their real estate investment division. It's not glamorous, but it pays well, and it would give you exposure to high-level development projects. You'd be working with clients who invest in properties worth millions of dollars. Client relations for real estate investors. Victoria was offering me the chance to work with the kind of people I'd become, managing relationships for wealthy clients who funded major development projects. The irony was so complete it was almost artistic. "That sounds like a really good opportunity," I managed to say. "Can I think about it over the holidays and get back to you?" She smiled with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a long-standing family problem. "Of course, take your time, but Marcus, I really think this could be the fresh start you need. You're smart and personable, and you understand more about business than you give yourself credit for. You just need the right environment to succeed." The right environment to succeed. My sister, who had no idea that I'd already created my own environment and was succeeding beyond anything our family had ever achieved, was offering me the chance to work for other people who were doing on a smaller scale what I was already accomplishing independently. I thanked her for thinking of me, and promised to consider the offer seriously. Then I drove home to my crappy apartment, where I spent the evening reviewing construction progress reports and
Approving change orders for a development project that was bigger and more innovative than anything Thompson and Associates had ever attempted. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. By day, I was Marcus Thompson, successful developer and visionary entrepreneur, making decisions that would transform how people thought about sustainable urban housing. By night, I was Marcus Thompson, family disappointment, grateful for job offers that would pay me a fraction of what I spent on construction materials every week. Something had to give, and in January it finally did. I was meeting with my construction foreman on site when my father's car pulled into the visitor parking area. I watched through the windows of the temporary site office as Robert Thompson stepped out of his Mercedes and looked around at the construction activity with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 40 years evaluating development projects. He was dressed in his usual business attire, carrying the leather portfolio he took to every professional meeting, clearly here in his capacity as a competitor trying to understand what kind of operation he was dealing with. I could have hidden in the office until he left. I could have asked the foreman to handle the conversation and maintained my anonymity for a few more months. But as I watched my father survey the construction site where I'd invested everything Aunt Evelyn had left me, I realized that the time for secrets had passed. This project was too big, too visible, and too successful to remain hidden much longer. More importantly, I was tired of living a double life, tired of accepting sympathy for problems I'd already solved, tired of pretending to be someone I'd stopped being the moment David Sterling's phone call had changed everything. I walked out of the site office and across the construction yard, past the solar array installation and the sustainable materials staging area, directly toward my father, He was studying the architectural plans posted on the information board, trying to decipher the scope and specifications of the project that had been puzzling him for months. Impressive operation, I said, stopping beside him. He turned, expecting to see a site supervisor or project manager, and his expression went through several distinct phases when he recognized me. Confusion, because I was the last person he'd expected to encounter at a major construction site. Recognition, as his brain processed the implications of my presence. And finally, something that looked like understanding beginning to dawn, though he clearly wasn't ready to accept what that understanding suggested. "Marcus," he said slowly, "what are you doing here?" "Working," I replied, which was technically accurate and completely insufficient. He looked around at the construction activity, at the crews installing energy-efficient systems that most developers considered too expensive to justify, at the scale of the project that had been intriguing him for months. Working on what? I could have offered another evasive answer, could have pretended I was doing consulting work for the mysterious development company that had been the subject of so much family speculation, but I was done with pretending. "Working on my development project," I said. "Thompson Sustainable Development. This is my company, Dad. This is what I've been building while you've been offering me career advice." The silence that followed was probably the longest pause in any conversation I'd ever had with my father. He stood there processing information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about my capabilities and resources, trying to reconcile the unemployed son who'd been accepting job suggestions with the developer, who'd apparently launched a major construction project without mentioning it to anyone in his family. "Your project," he repeated, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. "Marcus, this is an $80 million development. Where did you get the capital for something like this?" "Aunt Evelyn left me an inheritance. A substantial inheritance, more substantial than anyone realized." Another long pause while he processed this information. I could see him calculating, trying to understand how Aunt Evelyn could have accumulated enough wealth to fund a project of this scale, trying to figure out how he'd so completely misunderstood both his aunt's financial situation and his son's potential. How substantial? 63 million in total assets, real estate, investments, and liquid capital. She'd been building a portfolio for 70 years, and apparently she thought I was the best person to continue her work. My father looked around the construction site again, this time seeing it not as a competitor's project but as evidence that his underachieving son had quietly become the most successful developer in the family. His face went through several more expressions as the full implications hit him. "You've been sitting at our dinner table, listening to us offer you job suggestions, while you were running a development company that's bigger than ours." "That's correct." "You let Derek offer you part-time property management work when you own more real estate than the rest of us combined." "Also correct." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the sustainable building materials and advanced environmental systems that represented everything Thompson and Associates had always considered too risky to attempt. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was a fair question, and it deserved a complete answer, because I needed to prove that I could succeed on my own before you'd believe that I was capable of success. Because every time I'd tried to start a business, you'd assumed I would fail, and your assumptions became self-fulfilling prophecies, because I wanted you to see what I could accomplish when I had the resources to do it properly, without you trying to manage my decisions or steer me towards safer options. He nodded slowly, and I could see him remembering every conversation where he'd offered me gentle guidance toward more realistic goals, every family dinner where my struggles had been discussed with sympathetic concern, every job suggestion that had been offered with the best intentions, but had reinforced the narrative that I wasn't capable of creating my own opportunities. "The project looks impressive," he said finally. "Sustainable development is definitely the future of the industry." "It is. And this is just the beginning. I have plans for 3 more projects, each one larger and more innovative than this one. By next year, Thompson Sustainable Development will be handling more volume than Thompson and Associates. The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I'd just declared my intention to surpass the business my grandfather had built, and my father had spent his career expanding. I'd announced that the family disappointment was about to become the family's most successful member by a margin that would require them to completely revise their understanding of what success looked like. My father extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip was different than it had been at family dinners. This wasn't the handshake of a disappointed parent trying to encourage an underachieving son. This was the handshake of one businessman acknowledging another businessman's accomplishment. "Congratulations, Marcus. I'm proud of what you've built here." The phone call to my mother was brief but transformative. I told her about the inheritance, about the development company, about the project that would be completed in 3 months and would establish me as a major player in Chicago real estate. She was quiet for a long time before admitting that she'd always known I was capable of more than my circumstances had allowed, but she'd stopped believing I'd ever get the chance to prove it. Victoria's reaction was more complicated. She called me within an hour of hearing the news from our parents, and I could hear a mixture of amazement and something that might have been embarrassment in her voice. "Marcus, I can't believe you let me offer you that job at Bradford's firm when you were running your own development company. You must have thought I was completely condescending." "I thought you were trying to help," I said, which was true. But I also thought it was important for me to prove that I didn't need help before anyone would believe I was capable of succeeding without it. Derek was characteristically direct when he called later that evening. "So when I offered you the property management position, you already owned more real estate than our entire family combined." "Pretty much, yeah." He started laughing, the kind of genuine amusement that comes from recognizing the absurdity of a situation. "Jesus, Marcus. You really let us make fools of ourselves, didn't you?" "I let you be yourselves," I corrected. "I just didn't correct your assumptions about my situation." The family dinner 3 weeks later was unlike any gathering we'd ever had. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one with news to share, the one whose professional achievements were being celebrated, the one whose future plans were generating excitement and admiration. My parents asked detailed questions about sustainable building techniques and environmental regulations. Victoria wanted to understand the legal complexities of large-scale development projects. Derek was curious about the investment strategies that had allowed Aunt Evelyn to accumulate such substantial wealth. But the conversation that mattered most happened when we were saying goodbye, and my father pulled me aside for a private word. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. We spent years trying to fix what we thought was wrong with you, when what was actually wrong was that we couldn't see past our own limitations. You were trying to build something bigger than we could imagine, and instead of supporting that vision, we kept trying to shrink it down to fit our idea of what was realistic. You were trying to protect me from disappointment," I said. "I understand that." He shook his head. "We were protecting ourselves from the possibility that you might succeed in ways that would make our own achievements look small, and that's exactly what you've done, isn't it?" I looked at my father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. Robert Thompson, successful businessman and respected community leader, acknowledging that his underachieving son had quietly surpassed everything he'd spent his career building. "Dad, success isn't a competition. Thompson Sustainable Development and Thompson and Associates can both succeed. There's room in this market for different approaches to development." "Maybe," he said, "but there's only room for one family member to be known as the visionary who transformed how Chicago thinks about sustainable urban housing, and that's going to be you, isn't it?" 6 months later, Thompson Sustainable Development completed its first project, a 240-unit residential complex that achieved carbon neutrality while maintaining affordable rents and providing community spaces that transformed the entire neighborhood. The project won 3 environmental design awards and was featured in Architectural Digest as an example of what sustainable development could accomplish when environmental responsibility was prioritized over immediate profits. The waiting list for units in the complex was over 2,000 names long. Property values in the surrounding area increased by 30% within 6 months of the project's completion. 2 other cities approached me about similar developments in their markets. Thompson Sustainable Development was no longer an experimental company with unlimited capital, it was an established firm with a proven track record and a revolutionary approach to urban housing. My family attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing in the crowd of city officials and environmental advocates and community leaders who had gathered to celebrate what the mayor called a new model for responsible urban development. I saw my parents' faces as they looked around at what I'd built, as they listened to speakers describe the innovation and vision that had made the project possible, as they realized that their unemployed son had become someone whose work would influence how cities approached sustainable development for decades to come. That evening, at the celebration dinner I hosted for everyone who'd worked on the project, Victoria stood up to offer a toast. She looked directly at me as she raised her glass, and her words carried the weight of years of misunderstanding that had finally been corrected. To Marcus Thompson, who proved that the biggest risk isn't trying something that might fail, the biggest risk is never trying at all, because you're afraid of what success might require you to become. As I looked around the table at my family, my team, and the community leaders who were already discussing future collaborations, I thought about Aunt Evelyn's letter, about her belief that being different wasn't the same as being wrong. She'd been right about everything, about my potential, about the limitations of conventional thinking, about the importance of having the courage to build something genuinely new. But most importantly, she'd been right about the value of being underestimated. For 32 years, I'd been seen as the Thompson who couldn't quite get his life together, the family member who needed help and guidance and gentle steering toward more realistic goals. That underestimation had been painful, but it had also been liberating. While everyone was watching for me to fail in predictable ways, I'd been free to succeed in ways that no one had thought to anticipate. Thompson Sustainable Development now employs over 300 people and has projects in development in 7 cities. The company has been profitable from its first year and continues to establish new standards for environmentally responsible urban housing. I'm regularly invited to speak at conferences about sustainable development and innovative financing strategies for green construction projects. But the real measure of success isn't the money or the recognition or even the environmental impact of the buildings I've constructed. The real measure of success is the way my family looks at me now, with respect instead of sympathy, with curiosity about my vision instead of concern about my direction, with pride in what I've accomplished instead of worry about what I might fail to achieve. I'm no longer the broke Thompson, the family member who needs help and career guidance. I'm the Thompson who proved that sometimes the biggest opportunities come disguised as impossible dreams, and the people who love you most aren't always the people who understand your potential best. Aunt Evelyn understood though. She saw what I was trying to build before I fully understood it myself, and she gave me the resources to build it properly. More than that, she gave me the time and space to prove that being underestimated by everyone else doesn't matter if you never underestimate yourself. The morning after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, I woke up in my new penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, still wearing my suit from the celebration dinner. The contrast wasn't lost on me. 18 months earlier, I'd been waking up in a cramped Milwaukee apartment with a leaky ceiling and a neighbor who practiced drums at dawn. Now I was living in a space that cost more per month than most people earned in a year, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered unobstructed views of the city where I'd just transformed an abandoned industrial site into a model of sustainable urban development. But the apartment wasn't the real measure of how dramatically my life had changed. The real measure was the phone calls that had started coming in before 7 a.m. City planners from Minneapolis wanted to discuss adapting my sustainable development model for their downtown revitalization project. Environmental groups in Seattle were inquiring about my construction techniques and financing strategies. A documentary filmmaker from New York had called 3 times asking for interviews about what he was calling the new paradigm in responsible urban housing. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. Forbes wants to do a feature story on Thompson's sustainable development. They're calling it The Inheritance That Changed Chicago. Interested? Forbes. 6 months ago, I'd been reading Forbes articles about successful entrepreneurs while eating ramen noodles in my kitchen and wondering if I'd ever amount to anything more than the family disappointment. Now they wanted to write about me, about the company I'd built, about the inheritance that had transformed not just my life, but the entire landscape of sustainable development in Chicago. I scrolled through my missed calls and emails, trying to process the sheer volume of opportunities that were suddenly available to me. Investment groups wanted to partner on future projects. Universities were requesting guest lectures about innovative financing for green construction. 3 different cities had submitted formal proposals asking me to consider major development projects that would anchor their own environmental initiatives. The irony was overwhelming. For 32 years, I'd been searching for someone to give me a chance, begging for opportunities to prove what I could accomplish with the right resources and support. Now opportunities were finding me faster than I could evaluate them, and I had the luxury of choosing only the projects that aligned with my vision of what sustainable development should accomplish. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Derek Thompson, and I answered expecting to hear my younger brother's voice. Instead, I heard something I'd never heard from Derek before: genuine respect. "Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I need to say something. I've spent years assuming I was the successful brother because I built a profitable practice and made smart investments, but what you've accomplished makes my achievements look like practice exercises. You didn't just succeed in business, you created an entirely new way of thinking about urban development." I was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of Derek's words. My younger brother, the one who'd been held up as an example of practical success and financial responsibility, was acknowledging that my unconventional approach had produced results that dwarfed his own achievements. "Derek, we don't need to rank our successes. You built something valuable and sustainable, so did I. They're just different approaches." Interrupted me, something Derek rarely did in conversation. "No, Marcus, this isn't about different approaches, this is about vision versus competence. I was competent at following established paths to predictable success. You had the vision to create entirely new paths that nobody else was brave enough to attempt." After we hung up, I sat in my living room, looking out at the Chicago skyline and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. Derek's acknowledgement meant more to me than all the Forbes articles and documentary requests combined, because it represented something I'd been seeking my entire adult life: recognition from my family that my different way of thinking wasn't a character flaw that needed to be corrected, but a strength that could produce extraordinary results when properly supported. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find my father standing in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression he used when he had something important to discuss. Robert Thompson had never visited any of my previous apartments, not once in the years when I'd been struggling with unemployment and failed business ventures. But here he was, at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday, wanting to have a conversation that apparently couldn't wait for our next family gathering. "I brought coffee," he said, as if that explained his unannounced visit. "I thought we should talk." I invited him in, and he spent several minutes walking around my apartment, examining the architectural details and the view of the lakefront. He paused at the wall, where I'd hung framed photographs of the sustainable development project at various stages of construction, studying the images with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 40 years evaluating real estate developments. "These pictures tell an impressive story," he said finally. You can see the transformation from abandoned industrial site to thriving community, but what's really impressive is what's not visible in the photographs: the environmental systems, the energy efficiency, the long-term sustainability features that will matter decades from now. I handed him one of the coffee cups and waited for him to continue, sensing that he had something specific he wanted to say. Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about what I said regarding apologies and misunderstandings, but I realize there's something else I need to address, something that goes beyond just acknowledging your success. He paused, looking out at the lake, as if gathering his thoughts. When your grandfather started Thompson and Associates, he had a vision that was revolutionary for its time. He saw opportunities in Chicago real estate that other developers missed, and he was willing to take risks that more established firms wouldn't consider. Over the years, as the business grew and became successful, we became more conservative. We started focusing on proven strategies and safe investments rather than innovative approaches. I could see where this was heading, but I let him continue. What you've accomplished with Thompson Sustainable Development represents the kind of visionary thinking that built our family business in the first place. While we were managing incremental growth and maintaining market position, you were imagining entirely new possibilities for urban development. You were thinking like our grandfather thought, but we were too focused on conventional success to recognize it. My father set down his coffee and turned to face me directly. I want to propose something, and I need you to consider it seriously before you respond. Thompson and Associates has the established relationships and regulatory expertise that could accelerate your sustainable development initiatives. Thompson Sustainable Development has the innovative vision and environmental focus that could transform our traditional approach to real estate. What would you think about a partnership between our companies? A partnership. My father, who had spent years offering me career advice and suggesting I consider more realistic goals, was now proposing that his established development company partner with the business I'd built from scratch. The family enterprise that had written me off as unemployable was now seeking to align itself with the vision they'd once dismissed as impractical. What kind of partnership are you envisioning? I asked, genuinely curious about his thinking. A joint venture structure where Thompson and Associates handles regulatory compliance and municipal relationships, while Thompson Sustainable Development leads the design and environmental innovation. We'd combine our resources and expertise to pursue projects that neither company could tackle alone. I considered this carefully. The proposal made strategic sense. His company's experience with city governments and established contractor relationships could significantly accelerate my expansion plans, while my environmental expertise and sustainable development model could differentiate his company in an increasingly competitive market. Dad, I appreciate the offer, and I can see the business logic behind it, but I need to ask you something directly. Is this partnership offer based on respect for what I've accomplished, or is it motivated by concern that Thompson Sustainable Development might become serious competition for Thompson and Associates? He smiled, the first completely genuine smile I'd seen from him since the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Both, he said without hesitation. I respect what you've built, and I'm also concerned about competing with it. But mostly, I'm excited about the possibility of working with someone who thinks about development the way I used to think about it before I became too comfortable with conventional success. We spent the next 2 hours discussing the practical details of how such a partnership might work: legal structures, profit sharing, decision-making authority, project selection criteria. It was the kind of serious business conversation I'd always wanted to have with my father, but had never been able to, because he'd never seen me as someone capable of operating at his level. By the time he left, we'd outlined the framework for what would become Thompson Development Partners, a joint venture that would combine the resources and experience of both companies to pursue sustainable development projects throughout the Midwest. It wasn't a merger or an acquisition. Both companies would maintain their independence and distinct approaches, but it was a recognition that my vision for sustainable development and his expertise in traditional real estate could create something more powerful than either company could achieve alone.
The announcement of Thompson Development Partners generated significant interest from the real estate industry, environmental groups, and city governments throughout the region. Within 6 weeks, we'd received development proposals from 12 cities, ranging from small-scale residential projects to massive urban renewal initiatives that would reshape entire neighborhoods around principles of environmental sustainability and community development. But the project that really captured my imagination was a proposal from Detroit. The city was offering us the opportunity to redevelop a 200-acre former manufacturing district into a model sustainable community that would include residential housing, commercial space, educational facilities, and green infrastructure that could serve as a prototype for post-industrial urban renewal. The scale was unprecedented, a billion-dollar development project that would unfold over 15 years and would establish new standards for how cities could transform abandoned industrial areas into thriving, environmentally responsible communities. It was exactly the kind of ambitious transformative project that I'd been dreaming about since I'd first started thinking seriously about sustainable development. More importantly, it was the kind of project that would require every resource and capability that both Thompson companies could bring to bear. Neither my sustainable development expertise nor my father's traditional real estate experience would be sufficient alone, but together, they could potentially create something that would influence urban planning for decades to come. The proposal meeting with Detroit's Planning Commission was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February, and my father suggested that we drive up together to discuss strategy during the 3-hour trip. It would be the first time we'd traveled together for business purposes, the first time he'd treated me as a full partner in a major development conversation. As we drove through the industrial landscape of southern Michigan, past the abandoned factories and empty lots that marked the region's economic
transformation, my father asked me something that caught me completely off guard. Marcus, do you ever think about what would have happened if Aunt Evelyn hadn't left you the inheritance? If you'd continued struggling with unemployment and failed business ventures? I'd actually thought about this question many times over the past year, usually late at night when I was reviewing construction reports or approving change orders for projects that represented more money than I'd ever imagined having access to. I think I would have kept trying, I said. Maybe I would have eventually found smaller-scale projects that I could have handled with limited capital. Maybe I would have spent decades slowly building the kind of sustainable development company that I was able to create in 18 months with proper resources. But you might have given up. You might have accepted one of the job offers we kept suggesting and settled into the kind of conventional career path that would have never challenged the industry to think differently about urban development. He was right, and we both knew it. Without Aunt Evelyn's inheritance, I might have eventually succumbed to the financial pressure and family expectations that had been pushing me towards safer, more predictable career choices. I might have become a competent employee in someone else's real estate company, using my environmental interests as a hobby rather than a professional focus. What's your point, Dad? My point is that Aunt Evelyn didn't just give you money, she gave you the freedom to become who you were meant to be, without the constraints of other people's limitations and expectations, including mine. We drove in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of that observation. Aunt Evelyn had seen something in me that my own family had missed, not because they didn't love me, but because they'd been too focused on protecting me from failure to recognize my potential for extraordinary success. The Detroit meeting exceeded every expectation I'd had about how city officials and community leaders would respond to our sustainable development proposal. They didn't just want us to redevelop the manufacturing district, they wanted us to establish Detroit as a national model for how post-industrial cities could reinvent themselves around principles of environmental sustainability and economic opportunity. The project would include affordable housing designed to net zero energy standards, commercial spaces optimized for local businesses and green technology companies, educational facilities that would serve as research centers for sustainable construction techniques, and transportation infrastructure that would connect the new development to existing neighborhoods without displacing current residents. It was the kind of comprehensive, transformative project that would define a career, the kind of development that cities would study and replicate for generations, and they wanted Thompson Development Partners to lead the entire initiative. During the flight back to Chicago, my father and I spent most of the time discussing the logistics of managing a billion-dollar development project over 15 years. Team building, financing structures, regulatory coordination, community engagement strategies. It was the kind of complex, multifaceted challenge that would require every resource and capability our combined companies could provide. But the conversation that really mattered happened as we were landing, when my father looked at me and said something I'd been waiting my entire life to hear. "Marcus, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, not just proud of your success, but proud of your vision, proud of your persistence, proud of your refusal to accept limitations that other people tried to impose on you. You've become exactly the kind of developer your grandfather would have wanted to work with." 6 months later, Thompson Development Partners officially launched the Detroit Renaissance Project, beginning construction on what would become the largest sustainable development initiative in the Midwest. The groundbreaking ceremony was attended by environmental advocates, city officials, community leaders, and real estate professionals from throughout the region. My mother stood beside me as we posed for photographs at the construction site, looking around at the scale of what we were beginning to build. She'd been quiet during most of the ceremony, but as we watched the first crews begin site preparation work, she finally spoke. "Marcus, I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. We spent so much time trying to help you find your place in the world that we never stopped to consider that your place might be bigger than the world we could imagine." As I looked around at the Detroit site, at the teams of environmental engineers and sustainable construction specialists and community development coordinators who would spend the next 15 years turning an abandoned manufacturing district into a model sustainable community, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been the broke Thompson, the family disappointment who couldn't hold down a corporate job and whose business ventures never seemed to gain traction. I'd been living in a crappy apartment, borrowing money for rent, and listening to well-meaning family members offer career advice that assumed my ceiling was considerably lower than anyone had initially hoped. But Aunt Evelyn had seen something different. She'd seen the potential for transformative vision in my repeated failures to thrive in conventional business environments. She'd recognized that my struggles weren't evidence of limited capability, but evidence that I was designed for something bigger than the opportunities that had been available to me. The inheritance she left me wasn't just money, it was validation, resources, and most importantly, the freedom to prove that being different isn't the same as being wrong. It was the chance to show that sometimes the biggest opportunities are disguised as impossible dreams, and the people who seem least likely to succeed conventionally might be the most likely to succeed extraordinarily. Thompson Development Partners now manages sustainable development projects in 11 cities, employing over 800 people, and establishing new standards for environmentally responsible urban planning. The Detroit Renaissance Project has become a case study taught in urban planning programs and environmental policy courses throughout the country. But the real measure of success isn't the scale of the projects or the recognition from industry professionals. The real measure of success is that I'm finally living as the person Aunt Evelyn believed I could become, not despite my family's concerns and limitations, but because someone gave me the resources to transcend those limitations and prove what I was actually capable of accomplishing. I'm no longer the Thompson who needs help and guidance. I'm the Thompson who's changing how cities think about sustainable development. I'm the family member who proved that sometimes the biggest risk isn't failing at something ambitious, it's succeeding at something small because you're afraid to attempt something transformative. And every morning when I wake up in my penthouse apartment overlooking the lake, looking out at a city where I've fundamentally changed the conversation about sustainable urban housing, I think about Aunt Evelyn's letter and her belief that being underestimated by everyone else doesn't matter if you never underestimate yourself. She was right about everything. The family disappointment wasn't a disappointment at all, he was just getting started. 3 years had passed since the Detroit Renaissance project broke ground, and standing in my office on the 42nd floor of the newly completed Thompson Sustainable Development Headquarters, I could see the physical manifestation of everything that had changed in my life. The building itself was a testament to the principles Aunt Evelyn had believed in: carbon-neutral construction, innovative energy systems, and architectural design that prioritized both environmental responsibility and human comfort. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the original sustainable development complex that had started everything, now surrounded by 4 additional projects that had transformed an entire neighborhood into a model of green urban living. The waiting lists for units in our developments had grown to over 15,000 names, and we'd received development requests from 23 cities across North America. My assistant Rachel knocked and entered, carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized immediately. It was the same type of portfolio that Aunt Evelyn had used for her personal papers, and seeing it brought back memories of that day in David Sterling's office when I'd first learned about the inheritance that had changed everything. "This arrived by courier this morning," Rachel said, setting the portfolio on my desk. "It's from the Sterling law firm, marked for your personal attention." I opened it to find a letter in David Sterling's familiar handwriting, along with a smaller envelope that was addressed in script I hadn't seen in 3 years but recognized instantly. Aunt Evelyn's handwriting, though this looked older, more faded than the letter I'd received after her death. David's letter was brief: "Marcus, while organizing the final details of your aunt's estate, we discovered this letter in a safety deposit box that Miss Crawford had maintained since 1987. The instructions were specific: it was to be delivered to you exactly 3 years after you took possession of her inheritance. She apparently wanted to ensure you'd had sufficient time to understand what she was giving you before you read her final thoughts on the matter." I set David's letter aside and opened the envelope containing Aunt Evelyn's final message. The paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a soft brown that spoke of decades in storage. The date at the top read November 15, 1987, which meant she'd written this letter when I was 12 years old, long before anyone could have predicted the path my life would take. "My dear Marcus," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means my grand experiment in delayed gratification has succeeded, and you're now several years into what I hope has been a transformative journey of discovery about your own capabilities and potential." I had to pause and sit down, processing the implications of what she'd just written. Aunt Evelyn had planned this entire sequence of events when I was in 7th grade, before I'd shown any interest in business or development or environmental sustainability. She'd made decisions about my inheritance based on observations of a 12-year-old child that had somehow allowed her to predict what kind of adult I would become. "You're probably wondering how I could have been so certain about your potential when you were still a child," the letter continued, as if she could anticipate my thoughts across 3 decades. "The answer is that I wasn't certain about what you would accomplish, but I was certain about how you thought. Even as a child, you approached problems differently than your siblings. Where Victoria saw rules to be followed and Derek saw systems to be mastered, you saw possibilities to be imagined." She was right, though I'd never thought about it in those terms before. I remembered family gatherings when I was young, when the adults would discuss business or politics, and I'd inevitably ask questions that made them uncomfortable. Not because the questions were inappropriate, but because they challenged assumptions that everyone else had accepted without examination. I remember the Thanksgiving when you were 14 and asked why cities were designed to require cars for everything, why people couldn't walk to work and shopping and recreation in their own neighborhoods. Your father dismissed it as impractical idealism, but I saw it as exactly the kind of systems thinking that could transform urban planning if it were ever properly supported. I did remember that conversation, though I'd forgotten about it until reading her letter. I'd been fascinated by a documentary about European cities and had spent weeks thinking about why American cities seemed designed to separate where people lived from where they worked and shopped. My family had treated it as adolescent curiosity, but Aunt Evelyn had apparently seen it as evidence of something more significant.
The inheritance I'm leaving you isn't just money, Marcus, it's an investment in the possibility that someone with your way of thinking might be able to build things that people like me can only imagine. I've spent 70 years accumulating resources, and I'm betting all of them on the chance that you'll use them to prove that different ways of thinking can produce better ways of living. The letter went on for several pages, describing her observations of my childhood and adolescence, the patterns of thinking she'd noticed that had convinced her I was the right person to inherit her life's work. She'd been watching not just my failures and struggles in early adulthood, but the way I approached problems, the questions I asked, the solutions I imagined when I thought no one was paying attention. By the time you read this, you'll have discovered that being underestimated by people who love you isn't a disadvantage, it's a gift. It means you've been free to develop your vision without the pressure of other people's expectations. You've been able to think about possibilities that more successful people would never consider, because they've learned to limit their imagination to what seems achievable within existing systems. She'd understood something about my relationship with my family that I'd never been able to articulate clearly. They'd loved me enough to want to protect me from disappointment, but that protective instinct had led them to encourage me towards safer, smaller goals that wouldn't challenge their understanding of what success looked like. The real test of this inheritance isn't whether you can build successful businesses or accumulate wealth. The real test is whether you can use these resources to create things that matter beyond quarterly earnings, things that will still be improving people's lives 50 years from now. I believe you can, Marcus, but more importantly, I believe you will. The final paragraph of the letter contained instructions that caught me completely off guard. In the safety deposit box where you found this letter, there is one more gift. Not money or property, but something I hope will be more valuable to you at this stage of your journey. Open the second compartment of the box. You'll find detailed journals I kept during my travels, documenting innovative approaches to sustainable living that I observed in communities around the world. Consider them field notes for the work you're now doing. I called David Sterling immediately and asked him to meet me at the bank. Within 2 hours we were standing in front of Aunt Evelyn's safety deposit box, and David was opening a second compartment that I hadn't known existed. Inside were 12 leather-bound journals, each one filled with Aunt Evelyn's meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches of sustainable living practices she'd observed during her decades of travel. The journals were extraordinary, descriptions of solar heating systems she'd seen in rural Morocco that were more efficient than anything being used in American construction. Detailed drawings of water recycling systems from villages in Costa Rica that could be adapted for urban environments. Notes about community planning strategies from Danish co-housing projects that integrated social interaction with environmental sustainability. Each journal represented years of observation and research, documenting innovative approaches to sustainable living that most Western developers had never heard of. Aunt Evelyn had been conducting field research for sustainable development throughout her entire adult life, accumulating knowledge that could revolutionize how we thought about everything from energy systems to community design. But more than just technical information, the journals contained her thoughts about what made communities thrive, what encouraged people to take care of their environment, what created the conditions for long-term sustainability. She'd been studying not just the mechanics of green technology, but the social and economic factors that made sustainable living practices successful over generations. I spent the next month reading through every journal, taking notes and discussing the ideas with my development team. Many of Aunt Evelyn's observations could be directly applied to our current projects, particularly the Detroit Renaissance Initiative, which was designed to integrate exactly the kind of community-focused, sustainable living she'd been documenting for decades. The impact on our work was immediate and profound. We began incorporating water recycling systems, inspired by her notes from Costa Rica. We adapted community space designs based on her observations of Danish co-housing projects. We modified our energy systems using principles she'd learned from renewable energy cooperatives in rural Germany. But the most significant discovery was her final journal entry, written just months before her death. I've spent my life learning how people can live sustainably and happily in communities that support both human flourishing and environmental health. Now I need to trust that Marcus will have the vision and resources to build the kinds of communities I've only been able to visit and admire. Reading those words, I finally understood the full scope of what Aunt Evelyn had given me. Not just the financial resources to launch a development company, but a lifetime of research and observation that could guide the work for decades to come. She'd spent 70 years accumulating both the capital and the knowledge necessary to transform urban development, and she'd entrusted all of it to the family member who'd been dismissed as a dreamer and an underachiever. That evening, I called my parents and asked them to come to my office. I wanted to share Aunt Evelyn's journals with them, to show them the depth of planning and vision that had gone into my inheritance. When they arrived and I explained what I'd discovered, my mother started crying. She was watching you your entire childhood, my mother said, reading through one of the journals that contained observations about sustainable community design, alongside notes about my adolescent questions about urban planning. She saw something in you that we couldn't see because we were too focused on protecting you from disappointment. My father was examining a journal filled with sketches and technical notes about innovative construction techniques. These journals represent decades of research. She was building a curriculum for sustainable development long before anyone was talking about green construction as a major industry. We spent hours going through the journals together, and I watched my parents' understanding of Aunt Evelyn and of me evolve in real time. They'd always thought of her as eccentric, someone whose world travel and unconventional investments were charming but impractical. Now they could see that every trip, every investment, every seemingly random conversation about sustainable living had been part of a larger plan to document and understand how humans could live in harmony with their environment. She wasn't just giving you money, my father said finally. She was giving you a life's work, a mission that could transform how cities approach development for the next century. 6 months later, Thompson Development Partners launched the Evelyn Crawford Institute for Sustainable Community Development, a research and education center dedicated to implementing the principles and practices documented in her journals. The institute would work with universities, government agencies, and community organizations to promote the kind of integrated approach to sustainable living that Aunt Evelyn had been studying throughout her travels. The institute's first major project was a collaboration with 5 universities to create model communities based on the most promising practices from Aunt Evelyn's research. Each community would serve as a living laboratory for sustainable development, demonstrating how the principles she documented could be scaled and adapted for different climates and cultural contexts. Standing in the Institute's headquarters, looking at displays that showcase sustainable living practices from around the world, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years ago, I'd been the broke Thompson, the family disappointment who couldn't get his life together. Now I was running an organization that would influence sustainable development practices for generations to come. But the real transformation wasn't about money or success or recognition. The real transformation was about understanding that being different isn't a problem to be solved, it's a gift to be developed. Aunt Evelyn had seen that in me when I was 12 years old, and she'd spent the next 2 decades planning how to give me the resources and freedom to become who I was meant to be. The family dinner celebrating the Institute's opening was different from any gathering we'd ever had. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one whose work was being celebrated, whose vision was being discussed with admiration rather than concern. Victoria talked about the legal innovations required for sustainable community development. Derek discussed the health benefits of the kind of integrated living environments we were creating. My parents spoke with pride about a son whose work would influence urban planning long after their own achievements had been forgotten. But the conversation that mattered most happened as we were saying goodbye, when my mother pulled me aside for a private moment. "Marcus, I need you to know something. We were wrong about you, but more than that, we were wrong about what success looks like. We thought success meant following established paths to predictable achievements. You've shown us that real success means having the courage to imagine entirely new paths and the persistence to create them." As I drove home that evening, past the sustainable development projects that had transformed neighborhoods throughout Chicago, I thought about Aunt Evelyn's final gift and what it meant for the work still ahead. The journals contained enough ideas and observations to guide development projects for the next 50 years, each one representing an opportunity to create communities that supported both human flourishing and environmental health. I was no longer the Thompson who needed help and guidance, I was the Thompson who was changing how the world thought about sustainable living. I was the family member who'd proven that sometimes the biggest risk isn't failing at something ambitious, it's never attempting something transformative because you're afraid of what success might require you to become. And every morning when I walk into the Crawford Institute looking at research and projects that will influence how humans live on this planet for generations to come, I think about Aunt Evelyn's faith in a 12-year-old boy who asked uncomfortable questions about why cities were designed the way they were. She'd been right about everything. The family disappointment wasn't a disappointment at all, he was exactly who the world needed him to become. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.